So Moscow came out this morning and flatly said they haven't seen any real peace proposal from Washington. But here's what's actually interesting about that denial: the timing. Right before Trump and Zelensky are set to meet. And that timing isn't an accident. Before I walk you through this, quick thing. Drop the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to see where everyone's tuning in. I actually read a bunch of them last time, so keep them coming. You know what I noticed about the Kremlin statement today? It's not what they said, it's when they said it. Because Moscow had all weekend to issue this denial. They could have put it out Friday, let it sit, let the news cycle chew on it. But they didn't. They waited until Monday morning, right before Trump and Zelensky sit down in Washington. That's a choice, a deliberate one. And if you're paying attention, it tells you more than the actual words coming out of Dmitry Peskov's mouth. So let me walk you through what actually happened here, because the headlines are going to zoom right past the important stuff. Late Sunday night, there was a flurry of reporting, speculation really, that some kind of air ceasefire proposal was being floated, a pause on strikes against energy infrastructure, maybe a broader freeze on the front lines. Just enough to get both sides talking. By Monday morning, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov holds his daily briefing, and he basically says, "We haven't seen anything real. Nothing tangible, nothing specific." And on the surface, that sounds like a rejection, right? It sounds like Moscow is slamming the door. But let's think about that for a second. Because if there really was nothing on the table, if Washington truly hadn't proposed anything, then why issue a denial at all? Think about that. You don't go out of your way to say, "We haven't seen anything," unless there's a pretty good chance people are going to think you have seen something. That's communication 101. Denials are confirmations dressed up in different clothes. Now, Peskov also got asked about Zelensky's claim from last week. You remember that one? Where Zelensky said Moscow is preparing to receive 30,000 North Korean troops. 30,000. That's not a small number. That's a full division. And Peskov's response to that question? He declined to comment. He declined to comment. Let that sit. Because on one hand, he's saying Washington hasn't shown them anything concrete on peace. But on the other hand, he won't say a word about the North Korean troop situation. Not even to deny it. That's weird, right? You have to understand, in the world of Kremlin messaging, there's almost no such thing as an accident. Every word is weighed. Every pause is measured. Peskov isn't some random press secretary winging it. He's the mouthpiece for a machine that treats information like a weapon. So when he says nothing tangible on peace proposals, what he's really doing is setting the floor. He's telling the West, if you want to talk about peace, you better come correct. You better bring something concrete. You better bring something that accounts for Russia's territorial gains. You better bring something that acknowledges their security demands. Because that's the game, right? the Trump administration has been signaling for months that they want a deal. Trump himself has said he wants to end the war. He's called Zelensky. He's talked about bringing both sides together. But here's the problem with that. You can't just want peace. You have to be willing to pay for it. And the price tag on this war, it's not dollars. It's territory. It's security guarantees. It's NATO expansion or the lack of it. Those are the things that actually matter. And Russia is saying publicly and loudly that they haven't seen any real movement on those things. Now, there's another layer here, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the meeting between Trump and Zelensky isn't just another diplomatic photo op. It's happening in Washington, in the White House. That's not nothing. For Zelensky to be in that building, sitting across from the American president, that carries weight. And Moscow knows that. So their statement this morning is also a warning. It's Moscow looking at that meeting and saying, don't get any ideas. Don't think you can cut a side deal that leaves us out of the room. Because they've been burned before, and they haven't forgotten it. Let me back up a bit. Because if you haven't been following this whole thing closely, you might not realize just how much history is packed into this moment. The war in Ukraine has been grinding on for, over 3 years now? 3 years of trench warfare. 3 years of artillery duels. 3 years of frozen lines that move a few hundred meters in a good month and fall back twice that in a bad one. And through all of that, there have been peace proposals before. Lots of them. Some in Istanbul, some in Minsk, some just whispered in hotel rooms in Geneva. And almost every single one of them fell apart. Because the fundamental problem is that both sides think they can win. Or at least they think they can lose less than the other guy. That's the brutal math of this war. Russia has taken enormous casualties. Their economy is under strain. They burned through Soviet-era stockpiles that took decades to build. But they've also taken territory. They've ground down Ukrainian defenses. They've shown the world they're willing to absorb incredible punishment. And on the other side, Ukraine is fighting for survival. They've been propped up by Western aid, American money, European hardware, intelligence sharing that gives them eyes on every Russian move. Without that, the whole thing would collapse in weeks. So when you hear peace proposal, you have to understand what that really means. It means someone is going to have to give something up. And nobody wants to be the one who gives. Now, what's fascinating about the Kremlin's timing here, this Monday morning denial, is that it comes right after a weekend of speculation. And speculation is always useful for testing the waters. You float a rumor. You see how the other side reacts. You calibrate accordingly. I don't think it's an accident that we heard this air ceasefire proposal rumor over the weekend. I think someone wanted to see how Moscow would respond. I think someone wanted to see how Kyiv would respond. And I think Moscow's response, nothing tangible, is actually a kind of negotiation. Because they didn't say no. They said, we haven't seen anything. That's a very different thing. If Peskov had come out and said, these proposals are unacceptable, that would be a hard rejection. Door closed. End of discussion. But he didn't say that. He said, we haven't seen specific details. That's an invitation. It's a chilly, bureaucratic, Kremlin-style invitation. But it's still an invitation. It says, show us what you've got. Show us something real. And maybe we'll talk. I want to pause on that for a second, because I think it's easy to miss in the noise. There's a tendency in political commentary to treat every Russian statement as a lie, or a threat, or a deception. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it's just them communicating their position. And when they say they haven't seen anything tangible, they're also saying they're open to seeing something. That's not nothing. The meeting in Washington is going to be huge. Trump and Zelensky have had a complicated relationship, to say the least. There's been tension, there's been public criticism, there's been that whole thing with the aid package and the phone call and the impeachment. You remember all that. So the fact that they're sitting down together, face to face, in the Oval Office, that's a reset of sorts. It's a chance to move past all the baggage. Or at least, it's a chance to pretend they've moved past it. And if they can't reset, if Trump and Zelensky walk out of that meeting with no clarity, no roadmap, no shared vision for what happens next, then what? Because the war isn't going to freeze itself. The lines aren't going to hold forever. Every day, people are dying. Every night, drones are flying. The infrastructure is being hammered. The electricity grid is in pieces. The civilian population is exhausted. And here we are, months later, still talking about the same thing, still waiting for someone to make the first real move. It's infuriating, honestly. Let me go back to Peskov's briefing, because there's another part of it that I think is worth unpacking. He was asked about Zelensky's claim that Russia is preparing to receive 30,000 North Korean troops, and he declined to comment. That's a very specific thing to not comment on. You have to understand, North Korean troops in Ukraine would be a massive escalation. It would bring a third country's military forces directly into the conflict in a way we haven't seen yet. It would change the calculus for everyone. It would give Russia manpower they desperately need. But it would also complicate their relationship with China, with South Korea, with the entire international order. So when Peskov says no comment on that, he's either hiding something or he's trying to make everyone think he's hiding something. Either way, it's a signal. And the signal is, we have options. We have allies. We have resources that you might not fully understand. That's the kind of message that's meant for Washington. It's meant for the people sitting in the White House preparing for a meeting with Zelensky. It's meant to remind them that Russia is not isolated, not desperate, not backed into a corner. They're not. Now, I mentioned earlier that the word tangible is doing a lot of work in Peskov's statement. Let me break that down. Tangible, real, concrete, something you can touch. In diplomatic language, that's a demand. It's a way of saying, stop wasting our time with vague ideas. Stop floating trial balloons. Bring us something that actually addresses our concerns. Bring us a piece of paper with the security guarantees written in black and white. And the unspoken part of that is that they don't think Washington has that. They don't think Trump is prepared to make the kinds of concessions that would actually end the war. They don't think the U.S. is ready to give up on Ukraine's territorial integrity, or on NATO expansion, or on the broader vision of a Europe whole and free. And if they're right, then what are we even doing here? What's the point of these meetings, these phone calls, these press briefings, if nobody is willing to make the hard choice? That's the question that's hanging over everything right now. And here's what I think is really going on under the surface. I think the Trump administration is trying to thread a needle. They want to be seen as the peacemakers. They want to deliver a win. They want to show the American people that they can end this thing, bring the boys home, stop the money from flowing out. But they also don't want to be seen as selling out Ukraine. They don't want to be the ones who gave Russia what they wanted. They don't want the historical stain of appeasement. So they're trying to find a middle ground, a third way, something that gives Russia enough cover to claim victory, but gives Ukraine enough to claim survival. And the Kremlin knows that. They see it clearly. They're watching Trump try to balance all these competing pressures, and they're just waiting to see what he actually puts on the table. That's why Peskov's statement matters. It's not a rejection. It's a challenge. It's Moscow saying, you want to talk? Fine. But talk isn't enough. We need something tangible. And we haven't seen it yet. Now, there's a human element here that I think gets lost in all the strategy talk. Zelensky is flying to Washington. He's leaving his country, his people, his soldiers to go sit across from an American president and ask for something. What exactly? Another aid package? Security guarantees? A promise that the U.S. won't abandon them? Think about the weight of that, the pressure of that, the vulnerability of being in a foreign capital, dependent on foreign support, with the fate of your nation hanging on a handshake. I don't know how he does it, honestly. And Trump, he's sitting in the White House, the most powerful person in the world, with the ability to reshape the map of Europe with a single decision. That's not hyperbole. That's reality. The U.S. has the weapons. The U.S. has the money. The U.S. has the diplomatic leverage. If Trump decides to cut off aid tomorrow, Ukraine is in a completely different position. If Trump decides to pressure Zelensky into territorial concessions, he can do that too. So the meeting isn't just two leaders chatting. It's a power dynamic, a lopsided one, and Moscow is watching every second of it. Let me talk about the North Korean troop thing for a moment, because I think that's the wild card here. Zelensky has been saying for weeks that Russia is building up a force of North Korean soldiers. He's given numbers, he's talked about training camps, he's warned the world that this is a big deal, and Moscow won't even acknowledge it. That's interesting because if it weren't true, you'd think they'd just deny it. No, there are no North Korean troops. Quick, clean, done. But they won't say that. Instead, Peskov declines to comment. He leaves the question hanging. He lets the speculation run wild. Why? Because the threat of North Korean troops is more useful than the reality. If people think they're coming, if people are worried about that escalation, it changes the calculations. It makes Ukraine more desperate. It makes Europe more nervous. It makes the US more likely to give ground. It's a psychological weapon, and they're using it well. And look, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying Russian strategy is flawless. They've made plenty of mistakes. Their military performance in the early days of the war was embarrassing. Their logistics were a disaster. Their casualties have been enormous. But the one thing they've consistently done well is play the long game. They understand that wars are won by attrition. They understand that time is on their side if the West's attention span is short. And the West's attention span is short. We've got a presidential election coming up. We've got inflation. We've got the border. We've got China. We've got a dozen other crises demanding our attention. Ukraine is just one of them. And for a lot of Americans, it's not even the most important one. That's the cold reality, and Moscow knows it. So when Peskov says nothing tangible, he's also saying, we can wait. We can outlast you. We can grind this thing out for another year, another 2 years, another 5 years. Can Ukraine do that? Can Europe do that? Can the United States? That's the question that doesn't get asked in the press briefings, but it's the question that matters most. Now let me circle back to the meeting in Washington, because I think there's a version of this where Trump actually does put something concrete on the table. A real proposal, territorial lines, security guarantees, energy infrastructure protection. And if he does, if he brings something that has weight, then Peskov's statement today becomes the starting point for a negotiation, the floor, the baseline. We haven't seen anything tangible yet. Show us what you've got. That's not a rejection. That's an opening. So the real question, the one we should all be asking, is not whether Moscow has seen a proposal. It's whether Washington is ready to put one on the table that actually means something. And that's a much harder question to answer. Here's where I land on this whole thing. The Kremlin statement this morning was calculated, deliberate. It was meant to manage expectations before Trump and Zelensky even sit down. It was meant to frame the conversation, to set the terms, to remind everyone that Russia is still a player and can't be ignored. And it worked. Because here we are talking about it debating it, trying to figure out what it means. But the thing that's going to matter isn't what Peskov said today. It's what happens in Washington tomorrow. It's whether Trump and Zelensky walk out of that meeting with something real, something tangible, or whether they walk out with nothing. And if they walk out with nothing, then what was the point of any of this? What was the point of the meetings, the calls, the press briefings? What was the point of all the speculation about peace proposals if nobody was actually serious about making one? I don't have an answer to that. Not yet. But I'll be watching. And I think you should be too. Because the next few days, they're going to tell us a lot about Trump, about Zelensky, about whether this war is heading toward an end or whether it's just getting started on a new, more dangerous phase. And if North Korean troops do show up in Ukraine, if that's real, then all bets are off. Everything changes. The equation shifts in ways we can't fully predict. So keep your eyes open. Stay engaged. Don't just scroll past the headlines, because the details matter. The timing matters. The word choices matter. And that's the part that most people miss. Most people heard the news today and moved on. They heard Kremlin rejects peace proposal and thought, okay, nothing new, same old, same old. But it's not the same. It's never the same. There's always something underneath, something that's not being said directly. And that's why I go through this stuff. Not because it's easy, not because I enjoy the doom and gloom, but because I think it's important that someone is paying attention to the things that aren't being shouted from the rooftops. The war in Ukraine isn't going to be ended by a soundbite. It's going to be ended by hard choices, uncomfortable compromises, deals that nobody really wants to make. And those deals will happen in rooms we can't see, between people who aren't on the morning shows. But the signals are always there. In the timing of a press conference, in the choice of a single word, in the refusal to comment on something that probably deserves a comment. That's the language of power. And it's the language we have to learn to read. So let me leave you with this. Today, Moscow said they haven't seen anything tangible. Tomorrow, Washington hosts a meeting that could reshape the course of this war. Those two things are connected. And they're connected in a way that neither side is going to admit out loud. The question is, do you see it? Because I do. And it's bigger than the headlines suggest. This isn't over. It's never over. But at least now you know what to watch for. All right. That's where I'm at. Let me know what you make of this whole thing in the comments. I'm genuinely curious if you see it the same way, or if you think I'm reading too much into it. Either way, we're going to keep covering it. So if you want to stick around for what happens next, you know where to find me. We'll talk soon.